Delighted to be here in Leeds and really delighted to make this presentation. Now I'll go through it relatively quickly. The outline of my presentation will be looking at some European and global construction landscape, some aspects of performance standards in construction, and I'll be dealing with both at the individual level and the performance compliance aspects. Competence in construction is a big issue, and I don't know whether I or anyone, certainly I probably won't do an awful lot of justice to it, other than to maybe flag up some issues that has come up. And then European qualifications, which as president of the AEWBC I have been involved in. And on the future of construction, I always think of Einstein there. He says, I never think about the future, it comes soon enough. And I think Faz, your reference to Trevor Mole and myself and others, we're in that department there, that we've a bigger past than perhaps a future. So another thing Einstein said, which I believe in, two things are infinite, he said, the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about that the universe is in fact infinite. Now, looking at the European global landscape here, we're dealing with a big challenge in construction with a very disparate workforce. We're often working in silos, and I think many institutes actually do perform in silos. Now, I've been involved in the regulatory side of things on building control and other aspects in Ireland, and trying to make some impact in Europe. And I think it is a characteristic of professions that they tend to look after their own aspect. It presents challenges for coordination and integration to attain a successful outcome. There have been significant advances, obviously, in the area to improve working conditions, including safety, health and welfare and basic facilities. So the industry has moved on quite a bit. The construction industry is mobile, and that's a very interesting characteristic that in downturns such as we've experienced in Ireland in particular, Spain and other countries probably more so than the UK, mobility is very much a key factor, and that's close to everyone's heart within the AEWBC. So it transcends national, regional and global boundaries in the pursuit of commerce. The workforce, I think it's fair to say, is flexible and mobile. Education, training and development, which this institute here certainly makes a big impact on, is very important. It's both demanding and challenging. And we know it's sector specific, and very often when you're looking at CPD, it's project specific, and you don't have a one size fits all. It relies heavily on less than formalized and just in time training. So I think people are too busy, particularly in the current climate, with lean construction and trying to basically keep the wolf from the door. And handling CPD can be a challenge. So it's project specific, and it's a very competitive environment. Cultures vary throughout regional cultures as well as European and throughout the world. So it has evolved from a traditional craft-based industry, ranging from very non-complex structures, which can be very challenging in themselves, to more complex state-of-the-art environment. If you were to look at Porter, and I'm sure certainly the academics among you would be familiar with Porter's model, the ease of entry in the supply chain is more fragile, so big turnover in relation to building companies. R&D spending is modest. If you compare it to, I'm told Jaguar spent $1 billion on one prototype. I don't think the construction industry does anything like that in relation to R&D. And I think it puts it into context. The regulatory environment is more challenging and demanding, and I'll come to some examples later. We're operating in a global market where it's competitive, and people have to make decisions in real time on site, and things are not always as predictable as one would expect with drawings from the very start. So I think I've covered that. My apologies. And basically these are typical phases: feasibility, design, construction, operation, and then demolition. Every construction project has the same 6 stages, and I think I've certainly been a victim and a party to this particular process. It starts with great expectations, diminished hopes, utter panic, search for the guilty, and then look for somebody to blame. Punishment of the innocent and praise for the non-participants. I was involved in the introduction of the new building control regulations in Ireland, and I'd say you could put that model right across, that the people who are inside trying to make changes, when you come outside, somebody wants to hang it on you because you've agreed to something that may not be to everybody's satisfaction. Stakeholders' requirements there in relation to mobility. You have the professionals' needs, which is very much recognition and a potential passport to travel. Now, when I come to the European card, that is the theory of it, but it doesn't quite work out as a passport to practice. It's a facility to improve the potential for people to actually travel abroad, but it's not a panacea. Employers and clients, they want readily identifiable skills. And then the competent national authorities, who are not necessarily the ones we would be familiar with, say in the UK, like the RICS for surveyors, CIOB for construction management, etc. Competent authorities tend to be public sector bodies, and I'll come to that later. And they need assurance and reassurance that the advice that they're getting in relation to what they should be doing is in the public interest as well as the Institute's interest. One of the things I found in, this is tongue-in-cheek now, this slide, but when we got involved in the EU process, I was reminded of Johnson, who very famously said, "You're better off being inside a tent peeing out than outside peeing in." And this is not a reflection on the EU by showing the mannequin piece there. It just happens that that's a very famous statue in Brussels. I found the same thing when I was involved in the registration of professions in Ireland. Architects, engineers, they were inside a tent, and building surveyors were outside a tent. So Faz mentioned a few awards I got in Ireland that were mostly around the contribution, maybe the bluffing I did to get building surveyors involved in the process. And I think it has been a success there, whether you agree or disagree with regulation or regulation of function. There is a new building control amendment regulations in Ireland, which is quite unique. And the 3 categories of professions, building professions, that can inspect and certify and design are architects, engineers, and building surveyors. And some of the bodies that I'm involved in, CIOB, CABE, and others, they're mentioned in the Act. So that's a positive, and that's not the EU imposing it from outside. It was actually influenced from inside. Now, performance standards in construction, you have regulatory standards. They're generally performance-based and not prescriptive. And I'm showing here the Irish technical guidance documents. They're Euro-approved documents in the UK, and they are prima facie evidence of compliance. If you do it this way for non-complex buildings, that's how you do it. So they're all guidance. Regulatory compliance culture has a number of factors, and one is accountability. Everyone is accountable for their work. Vigilance, and it's important not to overly rely on good performance. That sounds a bit nanny state type, but I think it is important on construction sites to have a proper vigilance structure to ensure proper performance. Leadership, very much under pressure under construction sites. Documenting, reporting, learning from your mistakes, and we've made enough of them. equity and justice, engagement, empowerment, discipline, competency, communications, and I think most importantly, awareness and adaptability to change. Definition of a standard basically is a technical specification or other document drawn up with the cooperation and consensus, and that applies right across the board, not just to product standards, but also to bringing in new legislation. There has to be consensus in relation to it, and the general approval of all interests affected by it, based on the consolidated results of science, technology, and experience for the ultimate benefit of the customer or user. And I think that's something that I was involved in the Code of Practice working group and in the introduction of the new regulations. And one of the things we found as a group, and this, I represented surveyors, there was representative from the architects, engineers, builders, etc. We found ourselves, strangely enough, looking at it from the customer's perspective. When I say strangely enough, you go in there in your silos and you're looking after your own members. Then when you get in there, you realize that the real purpose of any regulation is the customer and the user. So the general requirement for building standards is good design with a suitable environment for prospective occupants, constructed in accordance with good building practice in compliance with planning and building, uncovered materials or methods of constructions are used. It's very important to have certification by a competent body as to their suitability. The structure in Ireland that we have is that the assigned certifier comes in at the start, the design certifier and the assigned certifier, and basically they take primary responsibility for it. Certification should confirm the suitability and durability of the product and materials. It's used for occupancy, the conditions in which it is to be used, and then the climatic conditions will vary across regions and Europe. And in Ireland and in the UK, there is an underlying principle that the life of the main structure will last in the order of about 60 years with normal levels of maintenance. On the construction product regulations, which have come in on July the 13th, it's the manufacturer's responsibility to carry out the conformity assessment. And that's a declaration, and it's issued that says that this is the testing that we've done on the product, not that it's fit for purpose, and then the CE marking is produced. So the general objectives and the main documents of the construction product directives have been incorporated within CPR, so that hasn't changed. But it aims to overcome technical barriers for putting something on sale in countries. But it's very important that you know what you're buying and don't rely on a CE marking. The CE marking will give you the testing and its general applicability, but the onus is on designers and people who purchase the material to ensure that it does comply. The manufacturer must keep documentation for 10 years, ensure consistent production, monitor the product on the market, and then you have surveillance authorities. In Ireland, it's the local authorities that will validate that the monitoring is correct, ensure the product is identifiable, indicate a contact point on the product, instructions and safety information in the appropriate languages, and then take corrective measures where necessary and cooperate with requests from national authorities. So you have SEN committees, EN standards, harmonised standards, and they are progressively coming more and more into play. They don't set performance standards, and I think I know certainly in Ireland that a lot of people are probably don't realise that all they're doing is validating the declaration of the testing, but not necessarily the suitability. The EN standards don't have a specific value, and then countries have been allowed to have a national annex where they state that these are values that must be met. Individual countries then designate a declared value. And within the specification, reference has been given to the harmonized technical standards. Before, Part D was the the building standards with all the BSs and the Irish standards. Now they're SEN standards. Has the product declaration of performance and its suitability been checked? That's important. We have a system of ancillary certifiers. We have primary certifiers in Ireland for the Building Control Amendment regulations, and that is the design certifier and the person who inspects. And then ancillary certifiers is everybody else who has had any impact in relation to the production, inspection, design, etc. Compliance matrix is important there, and to ensure that the AC, apologies for using acronyms here, is the assigned certifier, receives all the information. He or she is the person who pulls the proof that the building has complied with the regulations together. So recommendations then for standardization: enable systems integration, standard procurement contracts, set performance output specifications rather than inputs. I think this is all common sense. Appropriate cost data is important. Standardized assembly of components, training levels, and improve the project coordination and performance benchmarks. Whole life cycle costing is it's more than just, it's taking the product throughout its full life cycle. And I think very often people take the initial cost as being the cost of building. Something that costs more to produce at the start can, certainly give better value in the long run. It's widely acknowledged that the construction industry, that 2 to 3 times more money is spent. Now, this is from Rethinking Standards in Construction, which is a UK document, which I would certainly agree with, that you spend at least 2 to 3 times more money on the operation and maintenance of a building than on the construction. So that's where life cycle costing comes in. Now, competence in construction here, you start with the college, the graduates of Leeds as an example, and they're coming out, with the general capabilities and excellent capabilities, I think it's fair to say. But it doesn't stop there. Lifelong learning and CPD is a key factor. And I think that is the true measure of professionalism. Now, I'm showing this slide here, which is really showing where competence is. It's a roller coaster, in my opinion. Things change so much that you may be competent at a point in time, but in order to keep your competence relevant in the areas that professional areas that you're actually offering, it's very important to recognize that it is a roller coaster. It's not something that you just, I have my degree, my honours degree for life. That doesn't work like that anymore. So competent is being able to do something well. I've taken the simple one, but that's the Cambridge Advanced Learners Dictionary interpretation. The competent person is in Irish legislation in health and safety and in the building control regulations, and I'm sure it's the same here. It's having regard to the task that he or she is undertaking and taking account of the size and complexity of the project, possesses sufficient training experience and knowledge appropriate to the nature of work. Now, that's a big statement, and I think it's an important one. And when you're trying to get recognition in a European context, I think it shows the scale of the problem there, that how does one measure a general competence to do anything just on the basis of a title? A very difficult one. I'm involved in the Construction Industry Registration Board, which is a voluntary one at the moment this year in Ireland, and it will become statutory in a year's time. And one of the challenges that we found is, how do you measure company competence to do a job? So you look at the management, and you look at their competencies, you look at what they do, the type of projects they do, and then how do you ensure CPD? You're looking at a gap analysis of training needs. It's quite complex, and you have to do it across a very disparate industry, from small, and the bulk of the construction industry in the UK and Ireland, is made up of very small firms that wouldn't be even SMEs in the Continental's version. Offering service to a professional, client and stakeholder is another issue when you consider competence. If I think of a quantity surveyor, he's working, he or she, by and large for other professionals or for builders, and the reliance that they might have would not be as great as perhaps a building surveyor who's working for an individual client who's very reliant on them. So I've been on, I have served on the admissions board for competence of building surveyors, and we look very much at the client as being the person. It gets back to the charters looking after the consumers. So offering service to a client puts a greater onus on having sufficient competence and being able to do that. In a construction company, you're part of a team. You're probably part of a structured a process of learning and development. You have mentoring, you have all of these things. When an individual is out on their own, it's very much up to them to remain competent. Now, this is the Irish, I know the UK have, this is the national framework of qualifications, and this is on the academic side of things. We have 10 levels. Level 10 is a PhD, level 8 is an honours degree. In the UK, your level 8 would be our level 10. So, but it's quite similar. And this is the academic side of it, extremely important, but not the end of it. So lifelong learning, pursuit of knowledge for either personal or professional reasons, structured, monitored, facilitated and targeted CPD is very important. Strengthening the continuing education and training and certification is also extremely important. In another life, I was involved in on the training side of things and involved in developing competencies for different professions. And it can be extremely challenging because you have a very short window of opportunity. So many days people are prepared to be away from work, and then you have to satisfy yourself that whatever program you develop is sufficient to ensure that the quality assurance system will ensure that the person will be like, you're probably all familiar with Ronseal, it does what it says on the tin, so that the person can do what you expect them to do. You have things like BIM coming on board and certainly very exciting developments. Lifelong learning would use things like webinars and blended learning. And more, I've been involved in the Irish context in delivering webinars there, and I think they're great and good for busy people. Competency-based certification is also important, and the lifelong learning enhances social inclusion and personal development and also improves competitiveness. The European Professional Qualifications Directive, I think it's fair to say that the common platforms, I've described it here as shrouded in mist, difficult to navigate. Nobody understood it and nobody could make it work. And that's why they've moved to the professional card. And in relation to AEWBC and other bodies, I've referred to our circle of concern and influence. And it's an uphill struggle to actually get a system that will work for everybody. So barriers to practice in Europe is an issue. There's a conflict between subsidiarity and the broader general recognition, and a conflict between regulation and market-driven imperatives. The process needs to strike a balance between the right to free movement and the need to protect consumers. Now, recently the UK have what department is it now? BIS there. The Business and Innovation Skills Department have taken on board the role of the competent authority. And the competent authority, unlike what we envisaged maybe before, FIANI were the competent authority for engineers in Europe. AEWBC saw it as building surveyors or building experts, which is broader than just building surveying. But now I think the mechanics of implementing, I know the mechanics of implementing the Professional Qualifications Directive, particularly the professional card. We're a long way away from a common platform. But the mechanics of that is to place it within some governmental agency normally. In Ireland, it's the Department of Education. It's the Business and Innovation Skills Department in the UK. And the transposition of the directive there, or the changes to the directive, are due to be implemented on the 18th of January. You have 2 levels of recognition under the Professional Qualifications Directive. You have the sectoral directive, which has 7 professions, and they're called the Bloods Group. The only exception in that is the architects are part of that, good at lobbying and got their foot in the door, I think it's fair to say. And with a sectoral directive as an architect, one has almost an automatic right to practice in any country. If you take, say, the general directive, which is where building surveyors, engineers and others fit, it basically has to be justified on a case-by-case basis. You had compensating measures where the host country could decide you have to do A or B in order for us for regulated functions, activities or professions, in order for us to allow you to do that. Now, the automatic recognition, there have been improvements in the response period, 1 month to decide the outcome of it for the architects and the doctors, dentists, that group. Under the general directive, because it's more complex, there's 2 months for a competent authority to determine the outcome and decide whether a person gets this professional card. Well, the professional cards are being introduced incrementally. There's just a handful of professions at the moment that are coming through the system. They would include mountain climbers. Why, I don't know, but the EU in its wisdom decided that that was one. Another was estate agents, because I think they lobbied more successfully than maybe others. And maybe they're more of a cohesive group and coherent than others. Now, the other feature of the professional card is it's now going to be an electronic card and not physical, because they say a physical card can, it can be abused, and people can copy and generate cards from a back room or something. So the electronic card will be what they've decided on. Now, there's several types of mobility. If somebody just decides that they want to have a temporary mobility or a temporary card, the home member state is the one who issues it. For a permanent card, it's decided by the host state. And that makes sense, because the host state will be taking on board somebody for a longer period of time. Now, I'll just go quickly through the AEWBC, and I don't want to particularly bore you with it, but it was established to facilitate the promotion of professionally qualified building surveyors and construction experts in Europe. And for the UK, you'll recognise the CIOB, the RICS, the Chartered Institute of, or the Chartered Association of Building Engineers, and SIAT, the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists. So they're all members of the AEWBC. There are common core competencies, but the level is established, but people have different strengths within that. Actually, I think I spoiled my own slide here by saying this earlier. A profession involves a particular kind of relationship, this would be the definition, arising from the complexity of the subject matter, which deprives the client of the ability to make informed judgments for himself, and so renders him to a large extent dependent on the professional man. Now that goes back to 1971, and I'm old enough to at least remember 1970. I know Faz, you wouldn't be. But so that's the profession, and that's what we're talking about. That is the definition. And I've already said Bernard Shaw, being a very crusty individual, was suspicious of professions. He also said the reasonable man adapts himself to the world, and the unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. So therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. I think if you substitute unreasonable for somebody who challenges the system, and I think that's what we all need to do. Professional responsibility, we all have a responsibility to protect the environment, and I think that's important. We have a responsibility to leave this earth in the same manner or in a better condition than we inherited it. I'm not sure that we're doing that. We need to think sustainability. Now, one of the prayer now by Reinhold Niebuhr, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and it was something that I felt when I was going into the working groups in Ireland and in Europe. You know, it was a good one to reflect on. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that applies in trying to make inroads into either European legislation or national legislation. And Churchill is also features here, and very much so. I think his statement, now is not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, it's perhaps the end of the beginning. And that's where the professional card is. It's only started, it's not there. There's a lot to do in relation to that. So the sectoral directive, I've already referred to that. They're the architects and the Bloods group, the general directive. And then you have the overseeing body, which is the internal market body in the EU. And they're the people who advise the various bodies on how to administer the professional card. So there's single points of contact, and basically they use an online access point on the recognition of qualifications. So people apply online, and as I'm sure the Dean from your background will appreciate that the IT system has actually taken over. So the old cards have gone by the boards. And then the possibility to complete an online recognition procedures, that is felt will make things happen quicker. The stakeholders in Europe that I referred to earlier are the governments, the ministers, MEPs, consumer associations, social partners, SMEs, competent authorities, professional bodies, etc. So that's why it's so hard to get anything through Europe. Single points of contact, I think I've covered. Transparency and the mutual evaluation of regulated professionals, that's important. It's important that something is fair and is actually seen to be fair. The cost is another issue, and then they want it to be cost effective. So this is what it looks like here. You have the applicant here. He sends or uploads all the necessary document and requests a professional mobility card. Then it may go, if you say the German competent authority of the home country, they upload the documents, create a card, notifies the host member state and triggers a request, informs the professional that the recognition procedure has been launched, and then the host state, because the person is moving there, checks the validity of the documentation, decides to apply the compensation measures if appropriate. The ideal thing is that there are no compensation measures, but that's an ideal world. Informs the professional and competent authority in the home member states about the decision, and then after the compensation measures, validates the card. So no compensation measures, it goes straight through. Now, the IMI, which is the EU internal market, they are an intermediate source within that. So the professional uploads the documents, and then it comes back through that. Now, there's really not much difference in this, and I'm probably running a bit short of time, so I won't spend too much. But we saw the EURB, like FIANI here, as the reference source for the standard. But you'll still find that the home member state and the host member state, they are the bodies that make the calls. Now, there has to be and should be some cross-referencing back to the competent authorities for the profession, and that's where EURBE or RICS or whatever come in there. Okay, partial access, I think, is probably the key area that most people are concerned about, and that is because professions are different throughout Europe. It's very hard to get an exact measure, and it's very hard to send people back to college or whatever just to re-qualify. So it's where you have maybe design in France that is limited to architects only. You know, you have for building control purposes, as I've said now in Ireland, that the design certifier has to be a competent person, but has to be an architect, an engineer, or a building surveyor. More inclusive, but so the possibility to access some activities of a certain profession in another member state. The upstream approach, no a priori exclusion, but it's a case-by-case analysis by the competent authorities. As with the temporary cards. Clarification of the language. You cannot discriminate on language unless, you know, there's a real issue, and it's more probably in the medical profession than in the construction industry. Professional conduct, and that's where the institutes come in. They provide a strict code of professional conduct with possible sanctions. And the state registration process in Ireland, with all of the registration bodies, everybody has to buy into this code of conduct. Now, top-down or bottom-up, the AEWBC decided, taking the Fianni model to begin with, that we would do a bottom-up. So the AEWBC qualification has intrinsic merit in its own right. It is not a panacea for European, automatic or any registration. It's something that we have been trying and chipping away at Europe to try to get more of a say in the final process. Both options, top-down and bottom-up, they're not mutually exclusive, so we decided to pursue both. It has its own intrinsic value, and we try to exploit a bottom-up in the short to medium term, and then engage with all and keep our options open. It establishes a framework mechanism to facilitate mutual recognition. So it's very useful for bilateral recognition, and it's also very useful for different institutes to be able to benchmark the qualifications. It's primarily, but not exclusively, sorry, I'll just take a glass of water here, for those who wish to practice outside their own country. It covers virtual and actual mobility to carry with them a recognition of professional capability. It explores information about the various systems and the formation systems. It's more about recognition of equivalence and comparability rather than attempts at harmonization. Titles and labels in European countries are not always readily or universally recognizable or transferable. Surveyors even in Europe tend to be, it tends to be the UK, Irish, former, Commonwealth and former colonies, if you like, will all recognize surveyors. In another country, it's called an engineer. A quantity surveyor would be a cost engineer in many countries. So it doesn't transfer too easily. And the general public don't always know, the professions that we're familiar with. Differences exist in the extent of mandatory protection and restriction of the use of titles and functions. We have regulation of title in Ireland, and that's architects, building surveyors and quantity surveyors. But it now is linking into function with the Building Control Amendment regulations. Here's a very famous person, I'm sure you will all know, Sir Christopher Wren, St. Paul's Cathedral. And his title was Surveyor General of the King's Works. Was he an architect? Was he an engineer? Was he a scientist? His title was Surveyor. In local authorities in the UK, up to recently anyway, and in Ireland going back a long time, the county surveyor was a county engineer. So that's the issue. You've got a whole plethora of titles, and that can be a barrier to trying to get recognition. So it's not a one-size-fits all. We have different educational formation systems. Some are accredited by educational alone, and some institutes in Europe tend to be more of a trade union, more so than the various chartered bodies in the UK. Others are determined by educational and by competency assessment. The EURB card, such as it is, and you know, it is a professional card, but it is not the European professional card, no more than the FIANI one is not either. It's not just a once-off exercise. So back to our CPD, it's very important that people keep up to speed. Legislation and procedures constantly change, and there is a need to review it. Comparing European qualifications, we know that the CIOB is the competent authority for building, but that is just regulating the profession for the members. RICS, Society of Chartered Surveyors, which is RICS effectively in Ireland. They're the competent authorities for registration of titles, but yet for the purposes of the EU, it's the Department of Education that will process the applications for the professional card. AEWBC has 17 organisations with 14 members stretching from Italy in the north, from Finland in the north to Italy in the south, over 350,000 members, and we have a common equivalence. Professional mobility is not just, you know, going on a plane or whatever. It's geographic, it's occupational, it's virtual, permanent, temporary cross-border, free movement of workers and free movement of services. And basically the common platform was, as I've said, is an uphill struggle, and it doesn't look as though it will be achieved in the short term, but the European Professional Card is the halfway house in relation to that. Higher mobility throughout Europe because of the downturn in construction activity makes it even more important that we have a valid system and a fair system. So the EURB is more about recognition of equivalence and comparability than attempts at harmonisation. It establishes clear process for registration, sets out the process to be followed. CPD is important. Individuals have to do a current CV or a portfolio of appropriate training and evidence of membership of the professional organisations. Interviews may be required. Candidates with special needs are catered for, and the application is a combination of academic evidence supported by competence-based evidence. There is an online registration system where there's a pro forma form and you pay using the equivalent of PayPal, which is Relex. And then it was piloted and it is now live. And this is the structure of the EURB. There's an AEWBC oversight group, you have an appeals board, you have the European Monitoring Committee who are the first point of call, and they actually look at and make effectively the judgment on the suitability of the members. But it then goes to the European Monitoring, the National Monitoring Committee basically is the first point, and then the European Monitoring Committee accepts or rejects, and then there is an appeal. I won't go into this in any detail, but the routes are basically based on listed degrees, non-cognate degrees, and non-degree holders, but all have an opportunity to get the card. Very same as FIANI, and that was the FIANI model. There are 9 competencies in the EURB. The first is a comprehension of construction technology, building standards, building regulations, and building services. The professional role, and people have to describe how they are performing at a professional level. Construction technology, building standards, etc. Pathology, quality of construction materials, property and law, health and safety legislation, economics, cost and financial management, an understanding of design, including structural design, etc., project management, and then sustainability. So I'm sorry if I've gone on quite a bit here, but in summary, we've looked at the European and global construction landscape. It's quite a challenging one, I think it's fair to say. And construction, more than any other industry, people are likely to travel. They travel not just in Europe, you'll travel all over the world. Or, you know, it's a cyclical industry, and because of that, mobility is more important in construction than the mountain climbers or some of the others that are coming through the system at the moment. Performance standards in construction must comply, and it's important not just to know the local regulations, but it's very important that the construction product regulations are appreciated. Competence in construction is a challenge, and then European qualifications, they're here to stay. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.